Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to TEFAF Afternoons. I don't even know what the weather's like outside, but it's been kind of chilly in here, so I'm happy to have you here on a Saturday afternoon. You have the opportunity to do a lot of other things. I think this is going to be well worth your time. Before I get into the real introduction of the panel, I just want to say a couple of things. One is, please be sure to check your cell phone and turn it off. The best of us, raising my hand, often forget to do this, so I just check on mine. Thank you. Also, this is live streamed on Facebook, and will be on Facebook for a couple of weeks. You can see it there, and then it goes, after it's been edited, finally will go onto the website, so it's always available for you, as are all the panels that we've done since the fall of 2016. So you have a lot of resources to examine, to research, investigate if you'd like. This panel has a spectacular number of talented experts. All our panels are the same in that way. So I think you'd be very impressed by the number of curators, museum directors, and other art professionals that are speaking on a lot of topics, some of which you might be interested in. So, okay, here we are on feminism and interior design. As I was saying to the panelists, this idea came up several months ago, 6 months ago, maybe more, when I was talking to a friend about my problems with understanding the issues of interior design, and he said, I think you should consider doing something on feminism and interior design. And I thought, wow, that sounds great. What does it mean? So I am waiting for our panel today to explain the concepts of a feminist interior, feminism and interior design. I hand you over to Cotter Christian. Wait, now I've lost all his bona fides. Hang on, I'm on the wrong page. I'm really on the wrong page. Wait a minute. Embarrassing moment. Yes, thank you. Because he's got so many. He's director of the BFA Interior Design Program, assistant professor of interior design at Parsons School of Design, the New School.
Thank you. I guess I first just want to thank Linda for the opportunity to be here in this stunning space, to have a conversation that hopefully will be interesting and informative for you. As Linda mentioned, I am the director of the BFA Interior Design program at Parsons, and we've been teaching interior design for 113 years. And in that time, we've really watched how the curriculum has shifted based on public perception around interior design, starting with something that was really about the replication and reinterpretation of historical styles for high-end homes, to a radical departure in the 1970s when it became known as environmental design, and then a return to interior design more recently in a way that I hope, and some of my colleagues who are here, balances ideas like concept, social justice, professionalization, and environmental literacy in a profoundly interdisciplinary manner. So interior design has and continues to be associated with domesticity and the female. And there are many misconceptions about the profession among the general public. Indeed, how we celebrate, practice, and teach interior design may often be through the lens of architecture, and that lens is often male. In our brief discussion today, I really hope that we can unpack some of the issues facing the field of interior design related to feminism, and hopefully by viewing this field through this lens, we can add to an underdeveloped narrative and uncover ways that interior design and design in general benefits from its often marginalized status. But first, I want to introduce to you the panelists, and please fill me in if I mess up anything, all right? Or anything I've overlooked. So Lora Appleton is the founder of Kinder Modern Gallery and a designer at Studio Kinder, which curates an amazing collection of historic and contemporary design for children. Her work in this space looks at the importance of design as it's related to the growth and development of a child and family over time. She's also the founder of the Female Design Council, dedicated to serving women across the design disciplines And upcoming, during NYC by Design this year, she'll be curating Deeper Than Text, which is an exhibition at the First Dibs Gallery in Chelsea, celebrating the work of 19 female designers, which opens on May 10th. Yes? Excellent. And next to her is Virginia Black. Aside from teaching architecture and design really all over New York City, NYIT, Parsons, Pratt, Columbia, etc., Virginia is the co-founder of the Feminist Architecture Collaborative, or better known as F-Architecture, which merges theory, criticism, and activism through writing, exhibition, performance, and protest. Their work looks at how design strategies and methods can be used to support women in positions more precarious than those in the United States, including organizing a legal Arab gay pride party in Amman, or parade, sorry, in Amman, Jordan. And Sashi Khan was born in India, educated in the United Kingdom, and has had her career in the United States and around the world. She is the second-term president of the International Federation of Interior Architects and Designers, which is a 56-year-old organization whose mission is to elevate the profession of interior design at a global scale. She's also the founder of SC Collective, a multidisciplinary design firm operating in the US and the UK, and is actively involved in supporting professional rights of interior designers in New York State. And finally, Carly Cannell is the founder of the multidisciplinary design studio called We Too, which combines architecture, interior design, marketing, and branding. She's worked in a wide range of interior design projects from corporate workplace to residential, and she's been actively involved with the League of Women Designers chapters in Portland, Chicago, and is now working to start up the nonprofit here in New York City. The aim of the League is to provide a resource for women in design and help make them more visible. Carly's also active in academia as an instructor and advisor to interior design programs at Parsons. So thank you all so much for your work and for giving your time today for this conversation. I got a slew of questions here that I know I'm not going to get through, so I want to leave some time at the end as well for conversation with the audience. I want to begin with what was kind of a heated conversation when we met earlier this week, and that's about terminology. So since how we refer to ourselves is often an important part of our identity, and the field of interior design is really mired in an identity crisis, not to mention the way in which the field is perceived in popular culture. Designing Women, Will and Grace, HGTV, Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, etc., perpetuate this stereotype of a feminized, highly expressive, and decorative designer. This issue of identity is captured in the accompanying article found on the TEFAF website by Sarah Archer, which recalls a 1964 New York Times interview with Florence Knoll, where she profoundly states, "I am not a decorator." So Carly, if I can begin with you. I know that your degree is in interior architecture, and you often use that term to describe your practice. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means and how that might relate to Florence Knoll's proud statement?
Oh, you had to start with me. I know you always give me that look when I say Sometimes I don't mean to say that, but it just comes out. Yeah, I think there was some confusion when I actually have a degree in interior architecture and then get into the profession, and I'm not allowed to use that term because it really doesn't exist in the United States. It's called interior design. And so I think sometimes when I'm talking about our work, it really is all-encompassing from the full interior. It isn't decoration. It isn't just furniture and fixtures and things like. It's much more encompassing. Doesn't mean that it doesn't include that. So I think I use that in the sense that it's going to be. I think people think about when you say interior architecture, they think about the actual structure of the interior. They think about systems. They think about lighting, and they think about a built environment. Versus, I think sometimes when we use the word interior design, they think about the surfaces, perhaps, or the things that fill the room. So it is something that we go back and forth on as to where what is the correct terminology, and I think there's actually a lot of confusion in the current profession.
Yeah, and I think interior decoration we also often associate with a luxury service and something that's only available to a privileged group of people. Do you sort of agree with that assessment?
I don't. It does seem like an additive, right? So Whereas when I think of interior design, I'm thinking about the spaces that we experience every single day, right? So you might be at, getting a cup of coffee, you might be at the library, you might be at the doctor's office. Those are all environments that have been designed. I think sometimes when you say, you're talking about the decorative arts, you think of luxury. You think of somebody that's able to hire a professional to adorn their space. And so I don't think that's always the case, but I definitely think that leans on that side.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And Sashi, I know that you grew up sort of with a family of architects, so I'm curious to hear about why you chose to pursue a career in the field of interior design.
Well, I think I have a slightly different perspective on what I think the interior is and what I think architecture is and what I think design is. To me, design is part science, part creativity, and it's a way to improve our built environment that is bigger than just the decorative or aesthetic or taste-making or a self-expression. It is about improving our society and culture and shaping our world and shaping human behavior. And so to answer your question, yes, I do. I come from a family of architects. My uncle was architect to Corbu in Chandigarh. And there was this tremendous bias that architects were the mother of all arts. And I would go often with my father, who was also an architect, and I would go to spaces, look at buildings, and I always felt that there's a much greater empathy needed for the built environment. It's different when you're inside of an environment versus when you're looking from the outside into a big object. And so for me, it was about shaping the narrative, the experience, the storytelling. So it was for me, it was a bigger context. Mm-hmm. I wanted to do it because that was really appealing to me. And then I entered the profession, and I worked in 3 major firms and studied architecture, interior design, industrial design, and realized that actually it was not just within my family or one country or one area of discipline, that this bias exists throughout my entire career, throughout all the nations in the world. And I must say it's been a challenge. I'm really grateful for this conversation because challenge of it is that for someone like me, who is female, who is marginalized because I am a minority, and then I am double whammy because I'm clearly not white American or British, or the profession I choose to go into that is really valuable, that is essential to our well-being, continues to be framed in the context of this sort of minority, a subcategory, which is very frustrating.
Are there any examples in other parts of the world where that is less true?
No, there aren't.
Yeah.
So Parsons is the first school in the world to start interior design. So you are actually part of a legacy, Carter, that is sort of extraordinary. And it starts with taste-making. And then Parsons takes it to Parsons Paris, mm-hmm. where the taste-making continues, and that's sort of the origins of interior design or decorating as it starts. And there are 194 or 95 countries, depending on what the UN recognizes as an official country in the world. Of those, there are only 5 that are allowed to call themselves interior architects. Every single other country, we're not allowed to call it that. A discipline can be called interior architecture, but you can't call the program, you can't call yourself that because architecture is a protected title. So in America, we have the oldest profession, we have a protected title, and yet what we do is so essential, and therein sits a dichotomy and affects our our stature as professionals.
I would love to comment.
Yeah,
on
please,
that. I think right now in 2019, we're really looking at a dichotomy across discipline, across gender. Definition is the real issue. How things used to be defined in the past, both from a physical standpoint, a gender standpoint, a discipline standpoint, and how all of this new invention of how we're communicating, how we're doing business is all very different. And I think that the past and the present, and then eventually the future, is a bit in conflict because of that. And so those of us that didn't go through traditional tracks in education or define our practice in certain ways, or someone like me who's working in this very little niche of design for children, it's all new, it's all confusing to people in the past. And so I think it's really important that while there is a huge importance in being able to call yourself an interior architect, and I totally understand how important that is with your education and with the long-standing practice of architecture, there is going to be so much change that hopefully that will also continue to change, and there'll be more acceptance and awareness that there's validity in all of these different areas, that we don't have to follow the past structures anymore.
I think, just to clarify, I don't really care what I call myself. If anyone knows, I'm not a big title person, but it's more about, similar to what you said, Sashi, the combination of the science and the arts. There is a discipline to interior design. There are safety issues, there are systems, there's lighting, there's environmental concern, environmental systems. There's a whole bunch of things that go into interior design that I think that's what we need, is like the understanding or the definition that this is all encompassing. Now you can think about that from a licensed interior designer. A licensed interior designer is required to know all of those things, and that maybe that's a distinction that is happening. But I think that when we're talking about, and I'm dying to hear what Virginia has to say. Sorry. I think that there's an importance. It's what I'm trying to get at isn't just about aesthetics and adornment. There's so much more power that goes into interior design, including how can an interior design environment address diversity or discrimination. There's sort of these other ideas that we're exploring in our practice and in our even in teaching. So
and so I mean we kind of have maybe established some boundaries of what those terms mean, and that makes Virginia's work very interesting because it's so along the margins of what we typically associate with proper interior design or architecture, for that matter, hence the name F architecture. And so I wonder if how being a feminist impacts your process or thinking about design, and also maybe even how that transcends into the classroom and how you teach young designers.
Yeah, so I think regarding the question of what a feminist interior is, maybe I can just start and offer up some kind of explanation. I think there's a question of how do we identify a feminist interior? Like, how do we know, is it by what it looks like? Is it defined by who made it? These are all questions that come up when we try to answer this. And I think that a lot of it is really about how the interior may operate on subjects, how it might work against systems of capital or systems of power that already exist. So we can think about interiors operating in multiple ways. They are a result of processes of collaboration amongst women or other identified people. And they're also things that act on people as well. So I think we have to think about how they function, how they come into existence before we start to think about what the aesthetic qualities of them are. And I think that's what distinguishes an interior that might result from feminist processes from an interior that might be feminine, one that might have qualities that we associate with the feminine. So moving to my practice and the ways that we operate, we have been collaborating with an Indigenous women's midwifery in Ecuador, and we have been trying to use our relationships and our access to institutions in the US in order to try to support them in various ways. And we designed a peaceful protest with them in Ecuador that was at UN Habitat 3. And so we started to think about a kind of interiority, a kind of quality of a space that could be supported or created whenever women come together with a goal in mind of empowering themselves and others and working against the systems of power that exist that have oppressed women across continents and identities. So in that way, I think this interior that happened was an interior that resulted when these women came together to support each other. And I think that maybe that is a very loose framework that maybe seems bizarre at first to say, oh, maybe it doesn't have walls. But I think it's a way of thinking, a way of understanding that also translates into the classroom because it helps us to understand what the goals of a feminist approach to designing space are. And once we understand what those goals are, then we can start to work back to identify how interiors are operating within the profession and outside of it.
Mm-hmm. I think also that sort of lends to this idea of community of women designers, which both Lora and Carly have been involved in creating or being a part of these organizations that work to promote and elevate the work of women designers. So I'm curious if you could maybe tell us what was the impetus, Lora, for starting the Female Design Council?
I started the council shortly after the US election.
In 2016.
In 2016, yes.
It's an important distinction.
Yes, that's fair. That's fair. I was feeling very ill-defined, if you will, by the media, by the president who was elected, and was very much feeling that I needed to find a way to engage and not feel so frustrated by what was happening, as well as in my work. I was just up against a load of barriers on a consistent basis creatively and really wanted to reach out and have a bit of community. It happened very organically. I invited a few girlfriends to have a conversation, which grew, and we started having these open meetings for anyone in design to come and share their challenges, to talk about the things that they needed from a business perspective, what was missing, and also to really make some connection between disciplines. As a furniture designer and textile designer, I wasn't often always in the room with the same, like with the full landscape of different architects, structural engineers, designers, creators, makers, and I really wanted to see that, and I wanted it to be all women. And since then, I have been asked to show my own work, as well as highlighted many women's work through the work that we're doing with the cultural programming and various ways in which we're shining light on work that women are doing in design all over. It's been awesome.
Yeah. And what's the experience been, especially with regard to community and what that means for you as a designer and your process?
The League of Women Designers was actually started in Portland, Oregon by a woman named Carrie Merkel, who's fabulous. She is an industrial designer, and she moved to Chicago. And I was actually, as Connor mentioned, my business is multidisciplinary practice, and part of that practice was to dedicate at least, a percentage of our time every year on our own passions and projects. A lot of times this would be like an industrial design product, for example. And once a year in Chicago, where I started my firm, there would be this community art show. And it was basically where all different designers of all different types and artists would pull up to the loading docks in an industrial warehouse area in U-Hauls and open up our doors and have a spontaneous art show. And it was started by Moreland Sinaway of Chicago, really fantastic thing to be a part of. And that was kind of the first time having my own practice of being part of this community, which is really important, something that we looked forward to every year. And one of the years, Carrie came into my truck and she's like, hey, I want to introduce you to this idea, and do you want to be a part of it? And I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about, but okay. And so I started going to the meetings, and it was something that was started very organically. It was different. She'd basically just approach women in design, different types of design, to get together once a month. And it started to get more and more organized, of reaching out to women that might be excelling in a different type of design, hosting us all to teach us about their thinking and their practice. And it really, really expanded, and we finally got our nonprofit status last year. So that has been really important to me, because entering the profession and working in commercial architecture and architecture firms similar to you, I entered it, I won't say the year, but I entered it in a time where surprisingly women were, not even women, but design studios were not necessarily collaborative, even if we called ourselves collaborative, because there's definitely this guard that would happen in a design firm, like people are all trying to climb the ladder, right? And so I never really, I probably was a part of that early on too, but as I matured, I thought, this is just not the way I want to continue my design career. And so it really had an impact. That sense of community is really important to me. I'm not about myself, I'm not about showcasing myself, but I really feel like bringing different people together, men and women, is really valuable to any sort of design process. So having this League of Women Designers was actually incredibly powerful to me, and I became, like, my thinking and creativity actually expanded, because I thought, oh, I can reach out to these women. When I have a question about something, if I need a resource, if I see someone is doing something, I can help them, lift them up and help them achieve their goal. And it just became this very give and take without any expectations. And moving here to New York, I am still trying to figure out how to bring that same sensibility. So, and I'm always happy if you can help me do that.
So I think, we're making a lot of distinctions about gender and the field of interior design. And quite honestly, the conversations that I'm having with students now are a lot different around ideas of gender and sexuality, and the terms and the language that is being used is much different than what I'm familiar with. And there's a certain sense of fluidity, and there's a lot less of this kind of binary division between things. So what does that mean for design and for this conversation about the female and interior design?
I thought the conversation was about women and interior design,
Yeah.
So maybe we can have a conversation about that. I mean, one
Sure.
thing that I learned a few years ago is that the female is a term that has been used to describe a biological fact, a gender that you're assigned at birth, and it's based on the body that you have and the way that it's perceived by science. But I think that the term woman is a title that one claims, and it's a way of expressing one's gender identity. And I think it's really important to distinguish those things, because the gender binary is one of the primary tools of the patriarchy. I've said the B word. So it's one of the primary tools of power, that by keeping gender separate, we can start to also keep the tasks that we're responsible for separate. And within that, those separate categories, there is a dynamic of power, and you see that kind of subjugation carried out again in this interior design versus architecture conversation. So is architecture the thing that's first made the primary status, and then the interior is just put on the inside? Interior is just the secondary kind of act of occupying whatever the first creation is. So I think that Did I answer your question? I feel like the fluidity is something that is being explored in professionalization and outside of it, but also in terms of how we claim who we are in the world. And that's why it's really important to respect and acknowledge the ways that people are claiming that for themselves.
And I think, you started to talk about the project in Ecuador, and that the space itself became an interior that was part of that community, that was built by that community, right? And it didn't have the sort of top-down maybe approach to design. So one of the quotes that has been used at times in describing this, so Bell Hooks sort of recognized the position of marginality as a site of creativity and power. And with that in mind, I sort of would want to echo what Lucinda Havenhand, in an article in Design Issues about this very topic, sort of posit that a feminist interior in this context is one that is creative, is one that has the potential to kind of overlook dichotomies and blur the lines of disciplinarity. So I'd kind of invite each of you to ask how that lands for you.
Well, I can jump in a little bit on
Sure,
that.
yeah.
Because when we were talking about this panel discussion, I'm thinking, I don't ever think about it as male or female. I think of feminism, the term feminist as being power, and so there is like an assertion, there is an intent, there's things are decided for a reason, there's to me, it's a powerful word that I think can be encompassed by anybody. And so to me, a feminist interior is a powerful one. And that might, and I don't mean that it's like this necessarily where we're in medieval, but I think it's something where maybe it is the empathy and the intention, because when you're thinking about how to design an interior space, it's all about experience. Right? So you're designing that space so that we all interact with that space in a certain way, that it gives us certain feelings, certain actions. And to me, that is more encompassing of that term versus feminine or masculine.
So I look at a feminist interior also using the activity in how we think about a space on the different layers, who's working on the space, how we're collaborating, the pieces that you choose for that space, who made them, having a consciousness about the objects in the room, the history, the reverence of their creation and how they came about, who they were created by, I think is really important. And as far as the gender component, I want to touch on lately in relationship to this. I struggled a bit with naming the Female Design Council, and in our description it was anyone who identifies as female. And there's a very wide open scope in how that works for self-definition. And I think that women are dynamic and creativity is dynamic and powerful, and it cannot be put into one singular box. I don't want to be defined that way. Every room, every space, every piece of furniture that I work on has multiple layers and is going to look different. And so style is funny to tie in with feminism in a way, and I think that's where I get a little bit stuck. And so it's very interesting for me to hear all of these different perspectives, because this is what we're talking about. We each have our own grand space, if you will, of how we work and who we work with and how we define ourselves. And I think we would all consider ourselves feminists in some way, and yet we're all incredibly different.
See, I think it's a matter of sensibility. I'm not convinced that any profession is either masculine or feminine. And I really struggle with, I'm pro-women, no question, especially being a minority in such a male world. I mean, I think I said this to everyone. When I came to New York and I worked with the big firms, as a young designer, I was one of the few women and 20 men sitting at a table with contractors and partners and managers, and a little bit defiant, thinking, well, but I bring a level of knowledge here, and I matter just as much. And I think when I think about what that means in terms of my professionalism and what I have to offer the world as an expert, I don't think it would matter what I did. I do think that in design, I think that the male, female, my goodness, there is an historical divide between the two. The genders are so vastly defined throughout our history, our culture, through millennia, that there's a different sensibility that women bring to projects or bring to creativity versus what the male creativity does. And so, when we walked in here and we're looking at this room and we're saying, well, somebody said, oh, we're reclaiming it. And I was reminded of Frank Lloyd Wright, and I think Frank Lloyd Wright was a feminist architect. His interiors are, to me, very feminine. They're not the architect's architecture. And I just think that there are things we've defined in our history as being one or the other, when there may be other ways to think about creativity that is not really about gender. I was intrigued with your comment that said, well, but feminism isn't about gender. And I was taken aback with that.
No, I said feminism isn't gender.
Isn't gender. I would like to know what that is.
Well, I think when we're thinking about our gender, there's so many different layers to that, depending upon when you were born, how you think about yourself, what your biology was or is. Feminism encompasses gender, but again, you don't have to be a woman to be a feminist. So I think that I see those two words as working together, but they're two very distinct definitions.
Well, there's the right and the left side of brain for each one of us, regardless of gender, which is where, for me, this issue of whether it's a feminist profession or a feminine expression is difficult. Because then in that case, I was called a tomboy all my life. In that case, I'm very male, macho designer. And I don't think of myself as that either. Right?
I don't know what to say.
I think it's actually a good time. I wanted to leave an opportunity for some folks to ask questions from the audience. So I don't know how that necessarily works with regard to technology. Just like
Microphone.
We could use the shouting technology.
Yeah, I could drop my mic again and someone can pick it up and use it. Were there any questions from anyone here? Yeah, all the way in the back. Oh, and up front.
Hi, this has been very illuminating. I wondered, I guess for Sashi and what, as designers doing interiors, I mean, do you think, I would think your goal would be functional interiors. So are you ever designing as a feminist interior? Isn't it more about having it be a functional interior? Like, not a gender so much as, I mean, isn't functionality the most important thing? Would you say?
But so the question is functionality the most important criteria? I think that's how I'm sort of hearing it.
Yeah.
In the design process, and I would say that it is one of the essentials.
Yeah.
You can't design anything without making sure that it functions. Right. So for me, that's probably less about personality or identity or aesthetic or style or any of the other layers. And I think that one of the confusions in this conversation for me happens when there's a need to imbue one's design with a sense of self-expression. And that's where the art of it begins to come in. And we can't critique that very well, but we can critique the branding, the functional aspects, the circulation, all kinds of other criteria. And It's just too young of a profession, I think, to maybe have this conversation. I think that interiors is very muddled. You know, I'm going to be very provocative, actually, and say something I've been thinking for a while, which is that I would agree with you that we're living in a moment where there is a tremendous renaissance in the world. We're in a renaissance moment. 20 years from now, the world is a different place because of the fourth industrial revolution, the many changes, transformations taking place. So that, and we know that the profession of architecture and interiors and many of the design disciplines will actually become obsolete in the next 20 years. Well, if that's the case, then where do we sit in this conversation? And what is it that we do that supports the crafting of an environment, however you define it, with ceilings, walls, no walls, however you define that sort of space that allows for human beings to become bigger, better, and more than we can be through this intervention we call design. Not sure I answered your question.
I mean, going back to the question about functionality, function is a service. It's a service that you provide to a client. And I think that client has a point of view, they have a need, they have a desire, and those clients historically, if we look back at the history of interiors, if we look at the history of architecture, we can see that we, as professionals, have been in service to those in power. So I think function is not an apolitical context, or term. And so I think that's why for me, I can't disassociate the political from the professional.
One comment on that as well is I think design is about a solution as well. And all of us provide different services, different solutions. We're thinking about the different layers that hopefully we're looking back historically, whether it's from a political standpoint, a structural, a creative standpoint, in order to look forward. And so I am in service, yes, to my clients, but in my own creativity and the work that I do, it's very much important to think about the function in the room, the form in the room, the living, the intergenerational activity, like what are we really doing in that space? And then how does that space live on and transform? And how does it touch on sustainability? And all of these layers tap into the different components of who we are, what we need, and how we want it to function.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think if we're being honest here, we probably, if you asked us a month ago, we would never have said we designed feminist interiors, or even, except for Virginia, that's the name of her firm. But like I wouldn't have thought of that. So I think this is a conversation, like day one conversation that we're having, and even in a year from now, if you get the same panel, we probably have a lot of other things to add to that conversation. I think that in approaching a design, it is a lot about the end users and how, it's all of those things that we've been talking about, but it's also an expression of sort of taking that vision and actualizing the vision for our clients so that their culture and their function is present. And that to me is really what we specialize in. The idea of feminism hadn't really, come into my everyday practice at least in that thought process.
So it was over here and then over there.
First, I wanted to ask, it's better if I'll set up. Historically, most of the domestic architecture was commissioned by the wife, the woman of the house. So architects and designers were servicing a lot the women. So I think a lot of feminist architecture was present in historical interiors of residences and mansions. And my actual question is, I recently was looking at The Wing. It's a feminist co-working space, and I wanted to ask the panel to comment on the space.
Thank you.
I would love to take that one. I think that is a very limited view of feminist design, if you will. I think that it really Are you agreeing with that?
Yeah, I'm
So-
just like fangirling you for the
just to make sure, because so she's referring to the Wing, which is a co-working space designed for women by women, which, thank you.
It has a very, for those of you that haven't seen it, it has a very, what people might, who haven't dug very deep, think about what feminist design should be. It's very pink-driven, lots of curves. The makeup room is very Hollywood glam, like it's very tired. And while I appreciate that some people find it fresh, I think that they need to dig a little deeper, and I've made my feelings on that quite apparent. It's no disrespect to the people, I've worked with them, and I think that they are learning how to really integrate servicing women in our community, and they need to be looking at the community itself and how to layer up more creativity.
I'd like to maybe turn it a little. We live in a really interesting time. So part of you starting your venture had to do with being female in this particular moment. And this particular moment to me is one that is so incredibly polarized. And it's polarized precisely because we all are at these extremes. And I want to acknowledge that regardless of my gender, that I can do anything and be anyone and accomplish everything in a country that allows it. Although I'm not sure that's really the case today.
Allows.
I like to hope that that's kind of where we get to. So that's the boundaries that I like to try to live within or without.
Yeah, up in the front. Yeah.
My name is Jeffrey. I'm my background is in landscape architecture, but then actually I dropped all my licenses and I called myself an artist, which isn't sort of the theme of the fair, but it also allowed me to kind of drop the labels and stereotypes of what people expected me to do or how I could get sued, I guess, is the only reason why you have these licenses, right? So the name of the panel, and it's interesting because I think I've been for a while trying to figure out why are people still wanting to put themselves in boxes and these labels, and even to the point where when you're doing public jobs, they're doing these things where you'll get points for an MBE minority business or a women-owned business, and I'm trying to figure out how does that, I want to be selected on my own merit, not on my skin color or my gender. So I just want to see what your feelings are on that and how that maybe that these labels and these things of assistance actually is either hurting or helping the profession.
You want to take that?
Well, I think we all would have like interesting answers to this question. I think it's such an amazing question, and it's so pertinent to our time where identity politics are so significant. And I think in some ways it's a question of like, what is the role of affirmative action? Does it diminish the ways that you are perceived as a person with talent and skill and capacity, you know? I feel like I was going somewhere with this, but I lost it. I just love the question so much, and I think it's so hard to really figure out when to deploy one's identity in order to get in the room, you know? And I think that the problem is that, you know, if you are accepted on those terms, sometimes you are able to overcome them once you enter. It really depends on who's there, how they perceive you, and whether they want the content of your politics and what you have to offer, or they just want you to be a signifier of their way of being progressive, you know?
No, but I think it's, I love the question too, and I think it's a matter of values. So I was design director at Skidmore, Wings and Merrill, left the big job, started our own practice, and we had a choice. We could have been a woman-only business, and you know, I wouldn't do it. Wouldn't do it because precisely what you're saying, it didn't feel right to me that I would do it for a financial opportunity when in fact as a value system, it didn't, I just want to be acknowledged for being the expert that I am. and I want to be valued for that. I don't want to be labeled any one thing. And to me, it isn't about being called an interior designer or decorator or architect. Or I feel like all my life I've struggled just to be me.
Mm-hmm. Which really comes to wanting to be seen, right? And as a woman, it has been for me hard to be seen in the room, or I'm seen for my package, my external physical self, as opposed to my creativity and my ideas. I wanted to change the systems in the design landscape, specifically in New York where I work, that I was having issues with. The galleries that I work in and amongst are largely have male rosters, number one. So that was a really big point for me, was how can we get them to see that women are designing certainly completely equal, gorgeous furniture and interiors and all of these things, and to create awareness about that. I wanted to work on the systems of female-driven galleries and firms not being given fair share in art fairs, in design fairs, the cross of art and design. There's so many strict lanes, and I'm all for that. But I think it's really important that we can shine light on who you want to be, how you want to be it, and not be so judgmental. And still, like, I'm learning so much about, like, just the way that you communicate about the political components. I watched Taking Back the House last night, and that's so much about all of what we're really talking about, like being up against the patriarchy from all standpoints. And sometimes it's in work, and sometimes it's personal, and sometimes it's gender and relationship and how we interact with people. And it is going to affect our day-to-day work. And I personally want to be defined the way I want to define it.
If I can add on to that. I mean, coming from, I grew up in a small rural area in Northern California where I could do pretty much anything I wanted that was available, which was very limited because no one else wanted to do it. So I never really had like a lot of challenges, like, oh, somebody needs to organize this, I'll do it. And like everyone's like, And so going from the West Coast to the Midwest suddenly was a big, it was like, wow. I felt like I'd just taken a time machine back 10 years because suddenly I was feeling that's now the gender thing is an issue. And so I just, my approach was just, I'm just going to try to be the smartest person in the room and be a few steps ahead of these guys. And I think, that's the challenge that it presented at that point in time. But I've pretty much had my own thing going on since, 2002 probably. So I don't really think that I do face that sort of, woman gender thing occasionally. Maybe I just don't acknowledge it or give it any. When we were talking about this, I kind of think like maybe we should just be taking it back and saying, yeah, interior design is more powerful than architecture, so there, and we need to just change the conversation. But I guess I'm forgetting my train of thought here now.
Although there was an article in one of the papers just this week, you guys saw it, that was about of all the women running for in the Democratic Party, the attention that's been given to the male politicians versus the women. Did you see that? And I just was, because of this panel, I've been reading things like that more, and very aware that women have to work 5 times as hard, and that's what the article said.
Yeah.
That there are, I think, in every realm of media reporting, there are like twice as many men versus women, and so their opinion gets shaped by that.
Yes, and this is where I think things might be different 20 years from now, because we are in a position to help other women succeed. So maybe you don't have to try 5 times harder when you're starting out your career. It was something that when I was entering the profession, I did not have. I did not have that champion woman that was like, here, let me show you the way and let me mentor you in this way. I met them along the way for sure, and they made a huge difference. But that's, I think, when you're talking about, the organization that you started and the League of Women Designers, that's what we're trying to do, is just to make it more accessible for creating that visibility and creating those opportunities that may not have been there when we started out. So that's...
Do we have time for one more? Yeah.
Thanks so much for today, and I'm really happy that it hasn't been all about pinkwashing and bringing in more makeup stations and so on. And I think we can start to look at feminism in an ungendered manner, and I think it often comes up about diversity, inclusion, community, and so on. And I think feminism often, and you've spoken about yourselves, feminism is a lot about community and that kind of process. And you brought up the sort of way of a more feminist production to a design solution. Perhaps we can unpack that a little bit more. I'm really interested in, do you see a shift towards more of a collaborative design or a collective collaborative versus self-expression? And where does that lie in interior design if you're designing for a client? Do you think there's room for that sort of self-expression? And do you see a shift, and do we need to start shifting?
I see a shift. Maybe it's just the people that we're surrounding ourselves with. But there was something that actually F Architecture wrote on this topic where we were looking at the ways that designers have imaged themselves throughout history in order to be received in the academy and by the public. So there's a way that designers image themselves, and through imaging themselves, they image their work. So through this image of a singular figure, the heroic designer who brings the solution, they're able to convince people of their authority. Mm-hmm. Maybe now there's more skepticism of that model, I'm unsure, but I think that figuring collaboration is something that's so important and something that we need to assert in all of the forms of media that are available to us. And in this time of Instagram, we are able to put those images out there on a more consistent basis. Obviously there are things that are drawbacks about that media too, but I think we're able to show how these relationships are creating a space, and not to deny our dependency on one another in order to produce.
I think that that has a lot to do with tradition, and we'll call the new tradition, if you will, that if you look at historically male-heavy firms, if you will, there's a top-down process. And I've found a bit more lateral collaborative interplay with female-driven firms, the openness to judge in a different way, but I also feel like that's less about specific individual gender and more about the person behind the gender. I know it's something that I put into everything that I do is about learning and really growing, and to do that, it's collaborating. It's being in the room with incredible women like this and opening my mind to different ways of working, to understanding my strengths and my weakness in a working landscape. And what that means, and also to not judge someone when they walk in the room because of their gender, that they may or may not be the architect or the boss or the assistant or what have you. And all of those different layers impact how we work in teams. And everything that all of us do require extensive teams. Even if we're sole practitioners, we have to interact with different people in different ways. And so respect, regardless of all of this, goes a really long way.
I wanted to say one more thing. It's something that's been bothering me a lot recently, following the Me Too movement. I feel like we've been, as women, we've been really desperate to identify women who are role models, women we can look up to, and to put them in the media, but we haven't necessarily matched that enthusiasm with a level of criticality about the ways that these women practice and how they treat other women. So I would just encourage everyone to question that and to really interrogate that dynamic, and not to just celebrate any woman, because it's totally possible for any woman to replicate these systems and practices that have been so problematic and have repressed so many people.
Can I just add on to
Yeah,
that?
sure. Linda's walked to the front, so I have to be mindful
Sorry.
of
Linda,
that means something.
Real
No,
quick.
please.
I mean, I started my practice pretty early on as a collaborative because I was like, I don't know everything, you know? And so what inspires me, I guess when you're talking about the internal or the sort of self-projection, for me, what I really get excited about is learning new things and to be able to bring a team of people that have strengths and all these different factors come together into one like power team. To me, I just think like that's where I get really excited, and I'm learning on it. Every single day I'm learning. And I'm not walking into the room saying, I know everything and let me tell you what you want. I'm listening and I'm watching and I'm observing, and that's my personal approach to practice. The collective is what I seek every single day. And so, you know, that's what inspires me and evokes the creativity that I bring to the table. But I also agree, I don't really think of it as a gender thing, and I don't just work with people because they're women or not women. It's really about what are they bringing to the table. And I feel inspired by all different types of people from all different types of backgrounds and experiences.
Thank you. This was really, hopefully, a wonderful conversation for you. I know for me it's been truly enlightening and wonderful to be surrounded by your ideas. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
I just wanted to add a final footnote, actually, is that I've been working with the director of the Asia Society Museum for now about 8 months. Say working, we've been talking about doing a panel on terminology for a while. We will do it in the fall, for sure. It's so complicated. It's incredibly complicated. You know, our focus will be mainly on the arts. Why is Islamic art obviously mainly used for Middle Eastern art, when in fact the largest population of Islamic believers is in Indonesia. So, and yet that's a different kind of art. Why are Alaskan masks ethnographic as opposed to antiquities, which we only use applied to Roman and Greek art? So these are, you know, very obvious, but of course it's a much deeper and much more nuanced conversation than that. And I think it is relevant to this conversation because it crosses disciplines. And one of the things that when Hui and I got to at one point was the idea of, you know, the reality that structures have been set up that we've inherited in academics, particularly categories and ways of looking at things. And you do have to set up some sort of parameters in order to study things. That's obvious. And yet, there comes a moment when the forces, cultural forces in this case, put so much pressure on them that those things no longer work. So it's basically different words, different structures, different gender issues, ways of looking at the world. They work until they don't. And a lot of the things that we're talking about here are structures that just no longer work for us because of these cultural forces and waves of movement that are happening around them. So I think that is obviously something that almost in every panel that we do or have done, you realize that the zeitgeist, the subtext of them all is, as you brought up in your question, where are we moving? What's going to change? Do we need to change? And obviously we do, because these things aren't adequate to the moment. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you so much. Another applause to this great panel.